There's a person you still think about, not constantly, not with any urgency, just occasionally, in the specific quiet of an ordinary moment when nothing is demanding your attention. And the strange part isn't that you think about them, it's that after everything, after however it ended or faded or simply stopped, what you feel isn't quite grief and isn't quite relief. It's something harder to name, something that sits between those two things and refuses to resolve into either. Most people have at least one relationship in their history that defies the simple categories, not the ones that ended badly, not the ones that ended well, but the ones that ended somehow correctly in a way that felt wrong at the time and still doesn't feel entirely right. And yet you can't honestly say you wish it had gone differently, even though you wanted it to, even though you tried at some point to make it stay. There's a version of connection that arrives in your life with a specific intensity. Not romantic necessarily, sometimes a friendship, sometimes a mentor, sometimes someone you couldn't fully categorize. And that intensity feels, while it's happening, like evidence of permanence. Like the depth of the thing is itself a kind of promise. You assume, not consciously, just functionally, that something this real couldn't be temporary. That people who see you this clearly, who arrive in your life and rearrange something in you, must be staying. And then they don't, or you don't. Or the thing between you simply changes beyond recognition, slowly enough that there was never a clear moment where you could have held it together, even if you'd tried. What happens in the aftermath of that kind of ending is something most people don't talk about accurately. The surface grief is easy enough to name, but underneath it, there's something more disorienting. A question that doesn't ask, why did this end, but something stranger, something like, who was I supposed to become from this, and did I? As if the relationship itself was pointed at something, and now that it's gone, you're not sure whether you reached it or whether the work is still unfinished. You move on, mostly. Life has a momentum that carries you forward, regardless of whether you're ready. New things happen, time passes, the acute pain softens into something ambient, but the person stays in a particular compartment of memory that doesn't behave like other memories. It doesn't fade at the same rate. It resurfaces in specific situations. When you make a decision they would have had an opinion about, when you encounter something you know would have made them laugh, when you catch yourself about to say their name in a context where they no longer exist. And there's a grief specific to that. A grief that most of your current life has no container for, because the person isn't dead. The relationship wasn't a romance that gets culturally recognized as a real loss. And the ending wasn't dramatic enough to justify the weight it still carries. There's an uncomfortable realization somewhere inside this, that some of the people you've held on to the longest in memory are not the ones who gave you the most or stayed the longest or showed up most consistently. They're the ones who arrived when something in you was most open, most unfinished, most ready to be rearranged by contact with someone who saw things differently. And the rearranging happened, and then they left. And you've been living with the altered version of yourself ever since, which means in some sense they're still present, just not in any form you can have a conversation with. That's a strange kind of intimacy to outlive. What's even stranger is how difficult it is to explain this to someone who wasn't there. Not because the events are complicated, they usually aren't, but because the significance of certain people doesn't translate into summary. You can describe what happened and watch someone understand it intellectually while completely missing the particular weight of it. The thing that made that relationship matter wasn't the circumstances. It was the specific frequency of contact between who you were then and who they were then in that window of time under those particular conditions. And none of that survives being described, so you stop trying to describe it mostly. It becomes something you carry privately, returning to it in the quiet moments, holding it in the way you hold things that don't have a proper place to go. Most people, when they think about the relationships that shaped them, focus on the ones that lasted, the ones with clean narratives, the friendship that deepened over decades, the relationship that became a marriage, the mentor who stayed in your life long enough to see what they built in you. Those are real. Those matter. But there's a category of relationship that gets systematically under-examined, not because it was less significant, but because its significance doesn't fit any comfortable story structure. The people who didn't stay, the ones who arrived with a particular kind of intensity and left before the story found its resolution, the ones who changed something fundamental in you and then removed themselves from your life in a way that seemed at the time like pure loss. What if that removal was also part of what they were there to do? Not as comfort, not as a way of making the loss more palatable, but as a genuine question about what certain relationships are actually for and why some of the most formative connections in a person's life are precisely the ones that were never meant to be permanent. In the next part, we're going to look at that more closely, at what actually happens inside these relationships, why they carry the specific weight they do, and what it means that the people who rearranged you sometimes had to leave in order to finish doing it. Because the question of why certain people don't stay is almost never answered by looking at what went wrong. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. Something changes in you after a relationship like that ends. Not immediately. Immediately, you're just managing the practical reality of someone no longer being in your daily life. But over weeks, maybe months, something more subtle starts to surface. A different relationship to your own preferences. Opinions you didn't know you had until someone's absence revealed them. A slightly altered sense of what you're willing to tolerate in other people or in yourself that you can't fully trace back to a decision you made. It just arrived, or rather, it was left behind. That's the thing about the people who rearrange you. The rearranging doesn't require their continued presence. It already happened. The contact was long enough, or deep enough, or arrived at the right angle, and then you were different, and then they were gone, and the difference remained without the person who caused it. What tends to happen next is harder to sit with than the initial loss. Because the initial loss has a clear emotional shape. There's absence where presence used to be, and you grieve that absence with some version of whatever tools you have available. But what comes after that is less clean. It's the slow realization that the person changed something in you that you now have to carry forward without them. That the version of yourself they drew out, the one who thought differently, who spoke more honestly, who wanted different things under the warmth of that particular contact, that version is still here, still operational, and now somewhat unmoored. You find yourself doing things they would have noticed, making choices they would have had something to say about. Not because you're thinking of them, but because the influence was absorbed deeply enough that it continues running in the background of ordinary decisions, which is a strange kind of intimacy. One-sided now, continuous, invisible to everyone else in your life. There's a specific disorientation that comes from trying to locate yourself after a formative relationship ends. Not a crisis, not a breakdown, just a recurring, quiet uncertainty about which version of yourself is the current one. You were one thing before. You were something else in the presence of that person, and now you're something that contains both versions, plus the experience of losing the context that made the second one feel natural. None of those versions fully maps onto the others, and the effort of integrating them happens mostly without your permission, in the background, over a longer period than you expected. And because this process is invisible and non-dramatic, nobody around you knows it's happening. Your life looks continuous from the outside. You show up, you function, you participate in all the ordinary rhythms. But internally, there's a quiet recalibration occurring, a slow process of figuring out which parts of what that relationship brought out in you were always there and which were produced by the specific conditions of that contact. Because not all of it will survive the transition. Some of it was contextual, and letting go of those parts is its own kind of secondary grief that rarely gets acknowledged. The relationships that follow take on a strange quality during this period. You meet people, some of them genuinely good, genuinely interesting, and you show up for those connections with something that looks like openness but functions more like comparison. Not consciously, just structurally. Your nervous system has a reference point now for a particular kind of contact, how it felt to be known at a specific depth, to have a conversation that moved at a certain pace, to be with someone who required nothing to be performed or managed. And it measures subsequent connections against that reference point without asking your permission. Most of those connections come up short, not because the new people are less, but because the comparison isn't fair, and you know it's not fair, and knowing doesn't stop it from happening. So you spend time with people who care about you and feel, underneath the genuine warmth of it, a faint sense of translation, of being slightly less fully yourself than that earlier version managed to be. And you're not sure if that's about the new people, or about you, or about the particular conditions that can't be replicated, or about the fact that you opened to that degree once and something in you became cautious about opening to that degree again. Overthinking takes a specific shape during this. It doesn't circle the events of the relationship, not exactly. It circles the timing, the almost said things, the version of the conversation where something different was expressed, where the ending arrived differently or didn't arrive yet. Not because you believe that would have changed anything fundamental, but because the mind doesn't easily accept endings it didn't author. It keeps returning to the place where the ending was still pending, rehearsing alternatives, not to solve anything, but just to stay near the thing it hasn't finished processing. And the exhausting part of that isn't the thinking itself, it's the awareness running alongside it, that nothing productive is happening, that this particular loop has been run before, that you know where it goes, and that knowing where it goes doesn't close it. What starts to become uncomfortable when you stay with all of this long enough is a pattern in the discomfort itself. The way certain people, not all of them, but a recognizable type, arrive in your life and produce this particular quality of openness. The way the loss of them produces this particular quality of echo. It's too consistent to be coincidence, too specific to be explained entirely by the circumstances of each individual relationship. There's something underneath this that isn't about the people themselves. Something about what they were activating, what they were exposing, what was already present in you that only became visible in their presence and then stayed visible, awkwardly, after they left. What that something actually is, and why it keeps producing the same specific quality of connection and the same specific quality of loss, is what starts to come into focus next. The pattern becomes harder to dismiss once you've noticed it enough times. A particular kind of person arrives. The contact is immediate in a way that most contact isn't. Not necessarily romantic, not necessarily intense in any dramatic sense, just unusually direct. Like the usual distance between two people getting condensed in a way you can feel but can't explain, and in that compressed space, something in you that normally stays quiet starts moving. You speak differently, you think differently, you become, in the presence of that person, slightly more the version of yourself you recognize as real than the one you typically present, and then they leave. Or the connection changes, or life does what it does. and you're left holding the version of yourself they activated without the conditions that made it feel natural to be that person. If this has happened more than once in your life, and for most people, it has, the repetition is worth examining. Not with blame, not with the idea that something went wrong, but with genuine curiosity about what the pattern is actually tracking. The uncomfortable answer, and the one that tends to surface when you stay with this honestly, is that those people didn't create something in you. They revealed something that was already fully formed, already present, but that had been living behind a version of yourself assembled for other purposes. And the reason their absence left such a specific kind of echo isn't that they took something when they left. It's that after they left, you could still feel the thing they'd exposed, and you weren't entirely sure what to do with it in their absence. That distinction between something being created and something being revealed seems small until you follow it. Because if they created something, then their leaving takes it with them. The depth, the openness, the version of yourself that felt most alive in their company, gone with the relationship. But if they revealed something, then the leaving only removes the specific conditions that made the thing visible. The thing itself is still there, still yours, still waiting for you to relate to it directly rather than through the medium of another person's presence. Here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because if that version of yourself, the more honest one, the more alive one, the one that emerged in their presence, was already there before they arrived, then the question becomes, why wasn't it available the rest of the time? What, specifically, was it waiting for? What conditions did that particular person provide that your ordinary life didn't? The answer, followed to its actual bottom, usually has something to do with being received, specifically being received without the usual performance. That person, for whatever combination of reasons, created an environment where the edited version wasn't necessary, where you could be uncertain or sharp or more emotionally present than usual, without it changing how you were held. And in that environment, the less managed version emerged naturally, because the thing that normally kept it managed wasn't there, which means the management was never about who you are. It was a response to an environment, a reasonable, precisely calibrated response to the ordinary social world, which rewards the edited version and receives the unedited one with significantly more ambiguity. There's a layer underneath that worth going one step further into. The people who produced this kind of opening in you, were they special in themselves, or were they special in what they didn't require of you? Because those are different things. And the confusion between them is where a significant amount of the grief lives. When a relationship like this ends, the loss feels like losing a particular person, and it is that. But tangled with it is the loss of a particular experience of yourself that you only knew how to access in their presence. And because you've conflated the two, the grief for the person carries the grief for the self-access. And the whole thing becomes larger and more unresolvable than either component would be on its own. You miss them. And underneath that, you miss being the version of yourself you were around them. And underneath that, there's a quiet, uncomfortable question about why that version requires such specific conditions to emerge, rather than simply being available as the default. What gets quietly revealed inside that question, if you're willing to follow it, is a form of self-abandonment that doesn't look like self-abandonment from the inside. It looks like being realistic. It looks like understanding that the world requires a certain presentation, that relationships have different registers, that not everyone is available for the less managed version, and that's just how social life works. All of which is partially true. And all of which also functions as a very convincing reason to keep the unedited version conditional, available only in specific environments to specific people under specific circumstances, which means most of your life is being lived at a slight remove from yourself. And the moments when that remove lifted were so significant that the people who created the conditions for it became associated with something almost irreplaceable. They were not irreplaceable as people, but irreplaceable as mirrors. What they showed you about yourself in their presence is something most of your other relationships, for various reasons, haven't produced. And the instinct to keep returning to the memory of them, to keep holding that connection longer than its natural shelf life, is at least partly an attempt to stay near the reflection rather than find a way to stop needing the mirror. Seeing that clearly changes something in how the grief sits. Not dramatically, not in a way that makes the loss smaller or easier to explain to someone who wasn't there, but the quality of what's being grieved shifts slightly when you understand it with this kind of precision. It stops being purely about the person and starts being partly about the version of yourself you haven't yet found other conditions to inhabit. And a grief that includes that component is pointing somewhere that a grief purely about the other person isn't. Where it's pointing and what becomes possible when you actually follow it there, that's what opens up in the next part. The grief changes shape when you understand it correctly. Not lighter, not resolved, just differently held. Because once you see that part of what you've been mourning isn't purely the person, but the version of yourself that was available in their presence, something in the structure of the loss shifts. It's no longer only a story about someone who left. It becomes, quietly and a little uncomfortably, a story about something in you that was waiting for permission to exist. And that's a harder story to sit with because it removes the loss from the past and places it somewhere much closer to the present. The person is gone. That grief is real and it belongs to them. But the version of yourself they activated, that's still here. And the question of why it remains conditional, why it needed the specific environment of that relationship to feel available, is one that belongs entirely to you, not to their memory, not to the relationship, to you right now, in the ordinary life that continues after them. What tends to happen when that distinction finally settles is a quiet, slightly disorienting reorientation toward your own emotional history. You look back at the relationships that mattered most, and you notice, maybe for the first time, that the common thread wasn't the people. It was what you were allowed to be in their presence. The quality of contact that made those relationships feel significant was less about what they gave you and more about what they didn't require you to suppress. And that's a meaningful thing to understand because it clarifies something about what's been missing in the relationships that came after. Not the right person necessarily, but the right conditions, which are, to a greater degree than most people realize, something you have some capacity to influence. Not by manufacturing intimacy, not by deciding to be more open as an act of will. It doesn't work that way, and you probably know that from experience, but by becoming slightly less committed to the managed version as a default. By noticing, in ordinary conversations, the moments when the less edited version is actually safe to exist, and choosing, occasionally, to let it. There's an uncomfortable recognition somewhere inside this that takes a while to arrive at fully. Some of the people you've held onto the longest. Not the ones you're still actively missing, but the ones you return to in memory with that particular quality of warmth and ache. Some of them you held onto past the point where holding made sense. Not because the relationship still had somewhere to go, but because letting go completely felt like losing access to the version of yourself you were in their presence. As if releasing them would release that version too, and then who would you be? That's a form of grief most people never name clearly. Mourning a self as much as a person. Keeping the memory alive in part because the memory is the only place that version of you still lives in full. And there's something genuinely painful about recognizing that, not because it's wrong, but because it reveals how long that version has been dependent on external conditions to feel inhabitable. The cost of that dependence is something worth sitting with for a moment, not with self-criticism, not as a failing to be corrected, just as a clear accounting. The version of yourself that emerges in rare, specific, ideal conditions. How much of your actual life has it been present for? How much of the time you spend with people who care about you, who would stay for the unedited version if it were offered? Have you spent presenting the managed one instead? Not because you chose to, exactly, but because the conditions didn't feel safe enough, the history wasn't established enough, the moment wasn't right enough for the less protected version to feel warranted. And all of that is understandable. Every one of those calculations makes sense as an individual decision, but added together over years, they produce a life where the most real version of yourself has only been fully present for a handful of people, for a handful of periods, and the rest of the time has been running in the background of a more presentable exterior. That's not a failure of character. It's just a pattern that's been more expensive than it appeared. The people who didn't stay taught you something, not in the tidy sense of lessons learned and growth achieved, that framing is too clean for what actually happened, but in the more precise sense that their presence briefly suspended the ordinary conditions that keep the managed version in place. And in that suspension, you encountered a version of yourself that you've spent years either chasing or grieving or quietly filing away as the exception. What shifts when you see it this way is that the exception stops looking like something they gave you. It starts looking like something you already had that was waiting for slightly different conditions to surface, which means the people who didn't stay weren't taking it with them when they left. They were just no longer providing the specific circumstances under which you'd allow it to exist. And that is a different kind of information than the loss has been carrying all this time. There's no neat arrival point at the end of this realization. The relationships that mattered still mattered. The people who left are still gone. The version of yourself that flickered into view in their presence is still, in various ways, less than fully available in ordinary life. None of that resolves cleanly just because it's been seen more accurately, but something is different when you stop looking at those connections as proof of what's possible with the right person, and start looking at them as information about what's already present in you, waiting. Not for another rare person to arrive and create the conditions again, just for you to become gradually slightly less convinced that those conditions have to come from somewhere outside you before the version they revealed is allowed to simply exist. The thought that tends to linger after this is a quiet one, not a conclusion, more like a question that stays open. If the most alive version of yourself didn't require being built, if it was already there, revealed rather than created, then the only thing that's actually been standing between you and that version all this time is the specific conditions you've required before allowing it out. And that's worth sitting with long after this video ends. If something in this landed, the person still in your memory, the version of yourself you only find in certain connections, the grief that was partly about them and partly about you, I'd want to hear it. Not a polished response, just what's actually true right now. Leave it in the comments, because these realizations tend to arrive quietly and then disappear just as quietly if there's no space to acknowledge them. And sometimes the most useful thing is simply saying it somewhere, to someone, even briefly. Which part of this stayed with you?